A quick content disclaimer. Dead Space is an incredibly violent and gory survival horror game not suitable for younger audiences, which also contains themes of mental illness and psychological trauma. Viewer discretion is advised. Now let's get into it. Dead Space is a game best described as dark, both visually and tonally. It's a survival horror game that truly lives up to the survival part of its genre, especially in the mid to late game and on higher difficulties. In the beginning, the game seemingly showers you in resources to the point that it almost ceases to be scary, before slowly introducing more and more varieties of enemies that require different strategies to kill. From there, the difficulty continues to escalate as more and more enemy variants, as well as enemies with more speed and durability are introduced, and in greater numbers to overwhelm you. Once where you had an overabundance of ammo and health, you will eventually have to choose your weapon strategically per enemy you encounter and scavenge everything that you can just to survive. This escalation in difficulty correlates to an escalation in the horror, as the earliest areas that introduce one or two enemies at a time from a distance and are generally well lit provide a relatively easy proving ground, before they give way to mob fights in closed-off, blacked-out rooms where enemies can drop out of vents on top of you, are faster than you, climb on walls, and can attack you from any angle. As just mentioned, scavenging is heavily rewarded. This is a game that provides many opportunities to explore and find both lore and resources in its many rooms, lockers, and shelves. Furthermore, this is also a game that greatly rewards side questing, as the rooms that conclude optional objectives will also contain semiconductors and schematics that can be exchanged in the in-game store for whatever resources you may need. The store also organically expands based on your decisions, not based on milestones or progression. The schematics that you find allow those items to be replicated and purchased, so your ability to provide for yourself later in the game is entirely dependent on how much you choose to explore early. Lastly, the game also has a surprising degree of replayability and hardcore appeal. Playing the game on New Game Plus will allow players to unlock an additional suit upgrade while also netting more achievements that can be obtained in a single playthrough, which appeals to completionists, and the addition of Impossible Mode, a difficulty mode beyond hard, which takes all the tweaks made in hard mode and then adds 3 more conditions. 1, the player only gets 1 save file. 2, the game becomes a roguelike and death now means a full reset. And 3, the knowledge that if players do overcome this challenge, they will unlock a unique suit of armor and weapon as proof of their accomplishments. Nearly the entirety of Dead Space takes place aboard the USG Ishimura, a massive Planet Cracker-class mining vessel designed to break planets apart and draw their resources from within into orbit for processing. There are only 2 exceptions to this, being the short time the player spends on both the USM Valor and the planet of Aegis 7, but even in those circumstances, all areas share mostly the same architecture and design. This means that once the player becomes used to the design and the traversal of the Ishimura, they'll find themselves more comfortable traversing anywhere in the game thanks to an established principle of unity. The strong implementation of unity in the world design does sometimes run the risk of everything becoming samey or blending together, but the game also takes measures deliberately to ensure that this doesn't happen. Each of the main areas of the ship look and feel entirely different from one another despite all clearly belonging on the same ship. For example, hydroponics is generally green, spacious, and relatively peaceful, even if the green is killing you, while mining is amber, claustrophobic, and very, very loud. Likewise, the elevators used in hydroponics are only big enough for a couple of people to go up and down a floor or two. Meanwhile, mining uses this huge central freight elevator which travels a great distance to the depths of the ship to access multiple mining decks. Even the tone varies from location to location. Medical is desperate and blockaded, engineering is infested, and the crew quarters are ritualistic. Although the physical levels themselves are linear by definition, they don't suffer much, if at all, from the issues of linear level design. While the vast majority of the game takes place in or on various hallways and catwalks of the ships, the interior of the Ishimura is a maze. Areas of the ship interconnect with one another constantly, and in the times that they don't, more often than not, there will be a tram station which will connect the player to any other major part of the ship. And while the player runs along these mostly linear hallways that sprawl in all directions, they will also find that almost every single room they come across is actually accessible, which will either lead to more loot, encounters, or secrets. The game has fairly few glitches, with the most common occurrence of any programming oddities being the broken physics of any dismembered parts of enemies or anything else that you've broken. These are incredibly minor, however, and don't actually impact the gameplay in any meaningful way. Slightly more of a problem is an issue the game sometimes has with enemy pathfinding. Although fairly rare and likely to be patched, ranged enemies will sometimes not be sure how to reposition in order to hit you and so get stuck on geometry. The biggest problems that I had occurred only once each. The first is that a cutscene was entirely bugged, and here is a minor spoiler warning if you want to skip this specific part. The problem occurred in a cutscene where Isaac finds out that the initial transmission he'd been following was bait, and then has a forced conversation with Dr. Mercer after being trapped in stasis. Instead of getting trapped and having Mercer walk up to monologue, Isaac simply got stuck in place where he was at the console, and Mercer never entered the room. But because Mercer's audio is positioned based on his character model, he was just heard speaking from the next room over, unseen.
Are you the reason the marker won't begin?
The second was the time that the game pseudo-crashed and then froze as it tried to correct itself near the end of the game. While fighting these two guardians, things seemed to quickly fade and despawn on screen before cutting to black, and getting stuck in a never-ending loading screen. This never happened before or since, so if I had to guess, the game's internal status had probably bugged out to assume that either I had died or beaten the game. So it cut to black and was meant to load an endgame state, whichever one, which then left the programming not knowing what to load. Hey, just wanted to thank you for watching this far. You'd be surprised how many people don't. Please consider subscribing if you're new, don't touch the pointy space rock or listen to the voices in your head, and of course, beware spoilers from this point forward. The story of Dead Space is one of tragic twists and turns, and of the world's best engineer having the worst day of his life. Isaac Clarke is a repair technician and engineer for the Concordance Extraction Corporation, or CEC, a company specializing in resource gathering on a galactic scale for Earth and her colonies. He, along with a small team, are sent out on a repair mission to the USG Ishimura, the CEC's premier planet-cracking vessel, to fix a communications blackout. Isaac in particular is invested in this trip because his lover, Dr. Nicole Brennan, took a job with the Ishimura medical team at Isaac's encouragement. They've only been able to talk through vid calls for a long time, and Isaac hints that he may have said the wrong thing at one point in the past and wants to make up for it. However, the moment the team arrives, things go violently awry, first with their security corporal being skewered in front of them, and the monsters that did it chasing and separating Isaac from the rest of the team. These are the necromorphs. Reanimated, mutated, and sometimes amalgamated corpses that had been driven psychologically insane while they were alive thanks to the influence of the Marker, a huge stone artifact that the crew retrieved from deep within the planet while they were mining. Reveal after reveal takes place involving the crew, the knowledge of EarthGov, and most importantly, the members of the Church of Unitology, a religion founded around the Markers as their sacred artifact and a promise that, in the afterlife, all will be united as one being and one consciousness. As more is discovered, Isaac must fix all of the parts of the Ishimura that were evidently sabotaged by the many Unitologists that served aboard the ship as senior staff, including the blocked tram system, the air being turned into poison and hydroponics, the engine's disabled fuel lines and engineering, the communications array, and among other things, the many broken parts of the mining equipment which can be used to launch an SOS beacon. Along the way, as the player completes objectives, personal texts and audio logs, as well as recordings from the ship will reveal conspiracies between the CEC and the Church of Unitology, the knowledge and the use of that conspiracy as a method to contain and seal away the Marker at the cost of over thousands of lives, and the fate of Nicole as she tries to unravel their plans from the inside and save as many people as she can. Very little is left to the imagination, especially if the player completes the side missions following Nicole's investigation, which reveal, among many other things, that Isaac blamed Nicole for the death of his parents following his mother receiving therapy from her. He's desperately trying to make up for his mistake, which may have very well alienated the only person he truly loves, all the while coping with the onset of hallucinogenic dementia brought on by the presence of the Marker. The core of Dead Space's mechanical design is the combat, with a couple unique traversal ideas thrown in for good measure, which are executed on very well. The key to the combat is visually shown to the player the moment that they pick up their first makeshift weapon, the plasma cutter, written on the walls above the workbench in blood. Cut their limbs. Necromorphs are nigh impervious to all but overwhelming force. Forget shooting enemies in the head like other games, their heads can be completely decapitated and it won't even slow them down in the slightest. Therein lies the core mechanic that made Dead Space equal parts famous and infamous when it was originally released: dismemberment. The only way to defeat your enemies is to use your tools-turned weapons to rip them limb from limb, and then stomp them into a bloody paste until they stop moving, and ideally give you an item. Isaac will only acquire 2 weapons by default, with the rest being found through exploration or completing side quests. These 2 being the plasma cutter and the pulse rifle, with the latter being the only traditional weapon that Isaac ever wields in the game. Let's quickly run through all the weapons and break down what they can do. The plasma cutter is a cutting tool which can have its nozzle rotated 90 degrees to be either vertical or horizontal. It has a middling rate of fire and damage, but is exceptionally versatile at severing limbs and tentacles from any orientation at any range. The pulse rifle is a rapid-fire assault rifle which also has the added benefit of being able to place an explosive mine. The mine explosions don't actually hurt Isaac, so the alt-fire can be used as a very good early-game get-off-me tool if fired at his feet. And beyond that, they can effectively act as grenades if they direct impact an enemy at a distance. The Ripper is a portable buzzsaw, which holds a rapidly spinning blade in a magnetic field just out in front of you. It deals constant damage while spinning until the blade eventually heats up and breaks. Alternatively, the blade can be fired as a cutting projectile similarly to the plasma cutter, which in the best case scenario can one-shot a slasher by first cutting its legs and then ricocheting off of a wall to cut its arms. The line gun is a mining tool designed to cut raw ore, and acts as a much larger and more powerful plasma cutter, although without the versatility of being able to rotate its nozzle. Instead, it has the alt ability to fire off a plasma tether that acts as a tripwire, cutting through anything that crosses the beam. The line gun can be used to one-shot a lurker by severing more than one of its umbilical tentacles at once. The flamethrower is a repurposed hydrazine torch with the ability to deal mass continuous damage at close range, or alternatively drop down a canister which ignites into a firewall, slowing and damaging enemies as they pass through. Enemies will frequently stop and flail around in pain when set on fire, and the flamethrower is very effective at dealing with both guardians and hordes of swarmers. The contact beam is a directed energy tool designed to break down raw minerals into smaller pieces, and it's the highest raw damage dealer in the game, which outputs a consistent ranged beam of energy, which deals damage for as long as the beam is held on target. Alternatively, it can fire a single devastating shot after a short charge-up. Use this when you're getting overwhelmed and absolutely everything in front of you needs to be turned to ash. Lastly, the Force Gun is a graviton accelerator that's designed to act as a handheld blasting device when conventional explosives wouldn't work. It fires a blast of raw kinetic force in the immediate area in front of you, dealing massive damage and functioning as a shotgun. Its alternate fire creates a localized gravity well that holds enemies in place, which means that it deals exceptionally well with swarmers as well as the individual parts of dividers by holding them all in one place and then wiping them all at once. Additionally, things in the environment, as well as the enemies themselves, can be used as weapons. Isaac can use kinesis to levitate and throw small objects, and that includes the talons from slashers or the fan blades from vents. Traversal we will run through very quickly since the mechanics section has had a lot to cover, and firstly, Isaac gains the ability to use a mobile stasis unit, a part that integrates into his suit which slows down the individual time of an object that it's used on. This allows Isaac to get past quickly moving hazards that would otherwise kill him, such as malfunctioning doors, active mining equipment, and of course, the necromorphs. The most unique traversal mechanic that the game plays around with and executes on incredibly well is zero-gravity environments. There are many areas in the game which allow for zero-G movement, wherein Isaac can choose to disable the magnetic properties of his suit to freely float, and then expel gases to move around in truly 3D space. This leads to unique combat scenarios as leapers and lurkers use their ability to climb on walls and ceilings to track you down no matter where you try to fly to. Just try to avoid getting vertigo. The visual design of the game applies to both its gorgeous visual fidelity and the incredibly detailed models of the necromorphs that you'll fight. With the necromorphs in particular, the damage and dismemberment systems have been entirely overhauled since the original game. Necromorphs no longer simply have HP holistically, but instead each independent section of each limb has its own amount of damage it can take before being severed. Shots will strip away skin to muscle and muscle to bone, depending on the amount of damage done to that area, and this may be done to multiple sections of a limb at a time, meaning that the player both has to be more accurate with their shots by focusing on one part of one limb at a time, and the model of the enemy will always change to indicate exactly where it was that they were just weakened. The game also uses its visuals and spawning to retain an excellent sense of continuity. Many, if not a vast majority of games, will despawn dead enemies and broken objects, as well as reset the textures of terrain after a short period in time to save space. Dead Space, on the other hand, realistically leaves every interaction with the world intact after you leave it, even after the player leaves and returns to a given area. These changes are only ever undone when the player completes a chapter or a major milestone in the story, and never on screen. Even when this does happen, the game goes as far as to explain the phenomena of corpses and enemies disappearing as them being collected and congealed into something massive which is attempting to protect the marker. And without making the visual design section into a video essay unto itself, I'll quickly call attention to the seamless transition from the main menu into a loaded save file, as though the main menu was just a hologram that Isaac was looking at, the fact that all elements of the HUD, including your health, stasis, menus, and inventory screen, are all holograms or indicators projected from Isaac's suit, and the evolution of his suit's details and armor changing from beginning to end looks fantastic. Despite the attention to detail with the visuals, the sound design of the game is arguably done better and is even more important. Enemies' cries and screams pierce through the darkness to inform the player on where enemies are, or indeed even what type of enemies are present when they otherwise couldn't be identified or seen. One standout example is with the Hunter, the relentless mini-boss that pursues you through multiple chapters of the game, whose roars can be heard through the walls and vents of otherwise safe areas to indicate that it's still hunting you outside, serving both to make you question how safe you really are, and to warn you that you may have to confront it when you leave. The sound design is also leveraged to directly inform the player about Isaac's physical and mental state. When Isaac is attacked, scared, or running for an extended period of time, his heart rate will begin to audibly beat in your ears, increasing in rate according to his exertion or panic. Both Isaac's heart and breathing rates were allegedly sourced from a study of exercise in 40-year-old men, and Isaac's breathing also fluctuates based on how close he is to suffocating due to a lack of oxygen. This includes different responses on how short on air he actually was, ranging from merely having deep breaths afterwards, to coughing and hacking as his lungs rapidly replenish. In terms of his mental state, the dementia telepathically communicated through the marker causes victims to have visual and auditory hallucinations, and the moment of Isaac's psychological infection can be pinpointed to this moment in Chapter 1. Initially, Isaac simply has painful distortions in what he can see or hear, but eventually this evolves to hearing the whispers of distant voices whenever there is quiet downtime in the game. The evolution of his symptoms spiral out of control once he gets closer to the marker, as he begins to hallucinate full conversations that he's previously had with Nicole on the security monitors, which is how the players are informed on their joint backstory. Objectives on his rig will become corrupted and display the language of the marker instead of the language you chose. Corpses nearby will begin to speak with him, and before long, the player is left to question how much of what Isaac is experiencing is real, and how much of it is what the marker wants Isaac to see and hear for its own purposes. You know what? I'm gonna come out swinging. I'm gonna come out with a strong take and open my opinion section by saying that Dead Space Remake, Dead Space 2023, is far and away one of the best things that EA has ever produced, and it isn't close. The only other EA games that I can think of off the top of my head that are similar in quality are Jedi Fallen Order and Titanfall 2. And you know why this game is great? It's not because of how incredibly scary it is, or how beautiful it can look sometimes, or how well done the game mechanics and sound design were done. Those are all true, but that's not the reason. This game is great because they fell back on the archaic, dare I say ancient, game-making process that the industry has long since abandoned ever since mobile gaming pioneered the most efficient way to print free money in the early 2010s, especially abandoned by EA and Activision. Releasing a full, finished, quality product on its actual release date. A game with no monetary storefront, no battle passes, no microtransactions, no loot boxes, and no ways of manipulating you into spending more money in order to unlock parts of the game that you already paid for. With New Game Plus, a wide variety of achievements to hunt for and collect, and tangible, real, in-game rewards that you can really play with for playing on higher difficulties, which incentivizes player skill and gives the game longevity. To release a game made by people who clearly gave a crap about what they were making purely on the merit of making a good product that will actually review well and sell better because of a result of positive reputation that is earned through quality, not deception. This sounds like an angry rant, and it is a rant, but this is the happiest rant you've ever heard in your life. The gaming industry needs more games like Dead Space in order to revive AAA gaming. 10 out of 10 opinion score. This game is incredible. If you're old enough to consume the content and you're a fan of horror at all, buy Dead Space Remake. Do yourself a favor. Heck, do the industry a favor by showing that these types of games, these are the games that deserve to succeed. But now, it's time that I ask the dumbest question of this video. Enough about what I think. Is the game actually good? I usually have something quippy or profound to say during these outros, but for once, I just really don't have anything to add. I've said my piece. So once again, I'll just ask that you subscribe and like if you're new around here, stick around, and in the meantime, I've been Lone Wolf EX, and with your help, yes, your help, we'll finally be whole again.